Good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. Welcome wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. And I'm delighted to welcome viewers from across the globe for an international speaker this evening. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest Daniel Gross. I'll introduce Daniel in just a moment. A little bit of housekeeping first. Please do ask questions. You can do this by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. We will do our utmost to get through as many of your questions as we can. Let me also draw your attention to the chat facility. Use this if you want to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar. Finally, we are recording this talk and it will be available on the Milim website at milim.org.uk in the next couple of days. There you'll find recordings of other past events and details of our future events for which you can book tickets. And so to our speaker, Daniel Gross is a widely read writer on finance, economics and business history. Educated at Cornell University, he also holds an MA in American history from Harvard. Daniel has reported from more than 30 countries over as many years, commenting on everything from the dot-com boom to the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009. He's worked at the New York Republic, Bloomberg News, and the New York Times, authored 7 cover stories as a columnist and correspondent at Newsweek. Daniel is also a best-selling author of 8 books, including this one, A Banker's Journey, How Edmond Safra Built a Global Banking Financial Empire, and that is what he's going to be talking about this evening. Daniel's great-grandparents came to the United States from Aleppo and Damascus, which is relevant to the story he's about to tell us. So he joins us from Westport, Connecticut. Daniel, over to you.
Jonathan, thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I am going to presume that everybody can hear me and see me. If not, please shout. It is a great pleasure to be with you today in Leeds and all other points. I'm going to start sharing my screen. And start a slideshow. Great. So, yes, I'm here to talk about my book, A Banker's Journey, How Edmond Safra Built a Global Financial Empire. I always ask people when I start to give a talk if they knew who Edmond Safra was, if they had worked at one of his banks, if they had met him in person. And you can get wildly different results depending on where you are. If you're at your basic suburban synagogue in the US, very few people will have heard of him. If you're at a Sephardic community center in Geneva or in Israel or in Brooklyn, everybody will have heard of him, and many people will have known him because he was one of the great figures in Sephardic Jewry in the second half of the 20th century, and one of the great bankers. And this is the story I tell briefly. Who Edmond Safra was: he was born in 1932 in Beirut to a banking family. He died in 1999. Over the course of his life, he founded 4 banks on 3 different continents, including Republic Bank, which grew to be the 11th largest bank in the United States, Safra Republic Holdings in Geneva. He lived in 6 or 7 different countries at the same time, spoke 6 or 7 different languages, set his brothers up in business in Brazil, which then became one of the largest banks in that country. Along the way, he continued to own his father's tiny bank in Beirut, through the Israeli occupation, through the Civil War, through the Syrian occupation. He was a champion of the Sephardic Jewish diaspora, a philanthropist, and in many ways a private man, even though his banks were publicly held. For the Lebanese and Syrian Jewish community, he was a mix of a Rothschild, a Buffett, and an Oscar Schindler rolled into one, personally helping to keep these communities afloat. His banks, they were, again, the stocks were publicly held. They returned 25% year on year over a 30-year period. He had a view of banking that was totally different from how it was practiced in the US. And so it's a remarkable story. And it had not been told until this book has come out. Now, people have asked me, how did you get onto the story? Why are you doing this? Jonathan told you about some of my professional history. I covered global finance for the last 35 years. As a professional, I went to the World Economic Forum at Davos several times. I've interviewed heads of state and CEOs of banks, and that would qualify me to tell the story of what Edmond Safra did in his business life. But that's only part of it, because what animates this story is really who he was, and who he was a Syrian Jew who traced his origins to Aleppo. And conveniently, so do I. So that the person who would be able to tell the story in all its fullness would have to be somebody who can write sweeping narratives about the 20th century global finance, and also people who understand what it means when you make the sign of the Hamsa. People who understand what a sharmuta means in Arabic. People who understand why you name children after their living parents and adhere to all the customs. And if you were to construct a Venn diagram of people who can write these types of narratives and people who happen to be Syrian Jews, it's a very small overlap. And that overlap is me in a much younger publicity photo. My last name, of course, is Gross, which is about as Ashkenazi as you can get. My father is a nice Jewish boy from the Bronx. But he was an only child, and his parents died many years before I was born. And so we really didn't have any family on that side. The family I did have was my mother's family. My mother, who's still alive, was born in Brooklyn in the 1930s. Her name is Sandra Nasser. Our families were Nassers and Dweks. They were part of the Syrian community that had left Aleppo and Damascus in the 19-teens and the 1920s and came to New York, and still pretty much all live in the same neighborhood. My great-grandfather was born in Aleppo about the same time that Edmond Safra's father was. Growing up, when I heard my relatives cursing or making jokes, it was in Arabic. It was not in Yiddish. I had a sitta, not a bubi. We ate rice and kibbeh on Passover, not matzo ball soup and brisket. And that was the world I sort of grew up in. And so being able to understand this community, which can be insular and is very particular, was an important lever in being able to tell the story of Edmond Safra in full, because this was a man who, was known primarily as a banker. What I'm showing you on the screen is the 1972 public offering in London of Trade Development Bank. That's one of the banks he founded in Geneva in 1959. You can see it was fronted by manufacturers Hanover and Rothschild and Son. The Safras were very close to the Rothschilds. This offering in 1972 was the biggest IPO in London, the biggest post-war IPO in London to that time. He was a man who rubbed shoulders with David Rockefeller. I apologize for the blurriness of the photo here. But he was also a child of Beirut's Jewish quarter. And really, if you asked him, he would have told you, I'm a Beiruti, I'm a Halabi. A Halabi is someone who's from Aleppo. The story of Edmond Safra starts, as I mentioned, in Aleppo, which is one of the most unique Jewish communities there. Aleppo is mentioned in the Bible. It's referred to as Aram Tsova. There's been a continuous Jewish presence there for most of recorded history. The Great Synagogue of Aleppo has a cornerstone that dates to the 3rd century. The Aleppo Codex, which was a Torah scroll or book dating to the 9th century, is one of the oldest Sifrei Torah that we have in the world. Aleppo was an important point on the Silk Road. It was the 3rd largest city in the Ottoman Empire, and Jews were there. There were Jewish Aleppo rabbinic dynasties. There are Aleppo cantillations. It has a very rich and storied history. And Aleppo is where we first see the Safra family emerge onto paper in the 1870s. They were money changers, small-time bankers. The photo you're seeing now is a picture of the 4 Safra brothers in the 1870s. They called themselves Safra Frères. French was among their lingua francas. And at the time when the Ottoman Empire was an integrated unit, it made sense to do kind of what the Rothschilds did. One brother went to Alexandria. One brother went to Istanbul. One brother went to Beirut, and one brother stayed in Aleppo, and they worked together. They would finance trade, caravans, camel caravans coming from Kuwait and Iraq over to Istanbul. They financed local trade. One of those brothers was Edmond Safra's grandfather, who died very young. That left Edmond's father, Jacob Safra, as the sort of patriarch of that component of the family. Now, in 1914, World War I starts. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire starts to fall apart, and it doesn't make sense to have any longer this interconnected family business with branches in these different Ottoman capitals. So the Safra affair breaks up. Jacob Safra moves to Beirut. He moves to Beirut in 1920, and he sets up a bank called Bank Jacob Safra. In truth, it wasn't much of a bank. He would make loans to farmers. He would make loans to merchants. They engaged in factoring. But Jacob Safra found Beirut to be a particularly hospitable place. The photo you're seeing now is Jacob Safra in the middle with his wife Esther, who was a cousin of his, and 6 of their children. Edmond is on the left. Beirut in the 20s and 30s was a very particular and special place. It was French-speaking. It looked out onto the Mediterranean and had connections to Europe. There was this entente there between Muslims, Shiites, Sunnis, Druze, Christians, all part of a sort of functioning whole, as somebody put it. Beirut was a place where they put deals before ideals. So it was a great place to do business. And it was a place where the Jewish community was actually quite small and nascent, even though it was, right in the middle of where Jews had been living for centuries and centuries. The big synagogue in Beirut, Magen Abraham, was founded in 1927, but essentially a lot of the community there were Syrian Jews who had come from Aleppo and Damascus. This is where Edmond Safra is born in 1932 in Alais, which is a sort of suburb up the hill, is a sort of the summer place where the Jewish community used to go for the summer. He was born there in 1932. He attends schools. At the time, there was a network of Jewish schools called the Alliance Israélite Universelle. These were a network of Jewish schools that stemmed from Morocco in the west to Tehran in the east, that were backed by French philanthropists to give Jews a secular and Jewish education. And this is where we sort of locate the Safra family. What I'm showing you now is a promissory note that's signed to Jacob Safra. You can sort of see it on the right. And this is one of the many, many documents that were made available to me through the archive of the Safra Foundation, which contained family papers, personal correspondence, corporate correspondence, going back 70, 80 years in 6 or 7 different languages. And being able to understand and decode this is really part of I liken this to sort of dumping out a jigsaw puzzle with 5,000 pieces and trying to understand how they all fit together. This photo I'm showing you here is from the early 1950s. Jacob Safra is sort of in the middle on the right with the sort of large, tarbouche. In the middle is Ben-Zion Lichtman. This was the chief rabbi of Beirut, who was actually Ashkenazi. And to his right is Pierre Gemayel, who is one of the founders of the Phalange Party. Again, it shows how integrated the Jews were into the power structure. In Beirut in the 30s, 40s, even into the 50s, on Passover, people would come to the Jewish quarter where there was effectively like a parade, and all the dignitaries would show up. Of course, things in the Middle East start to change in the 1940s. And Jacob Safra identified his son Edmond as someone who could help the family carry on its business going forward. Now, Edmond was something of a savant. He would go with his father when he was 9 or 10 into the shuk and meet clients. He would talk about business. He would start apprenticing at the age of 12 or 13, and schooling really at the Alliance only went through the age of 15. Now, in the Syrian world, the oldest son is usually charged with leading the family forward. Edmond was the second oldest brother. He had an older brother named Eli, who was 8 or 9 years older. But Jacob Safra saw something in his second oldest son and said, I'm going to task him to take the family business forward. And in 1947, things are starting to unwind in the Middle East. Israel is about to be created. Jacob Safra decides that he's going to send Edmond to Milan. Edmond at the time was 15 years old. He's going to set up some bank accounts there. He's going to send Edmond there to start looking for a beachhead for the family business. And to get to Milan, the scene I paint in the opening chapter He drives to what was then Lod Airfield, what is now Ben Gurion Airport, because the only flight that left from Beirut to Milan left on a Saturday, and Edmond Safra did not travel on Shabbat. So he drove out into Palestine to Lod Airfield, flies to Rome, takes a bus to Milan. This is a photo of him in Europe. At the time, he was probably 16, 17, 18 years old. He always looked much older than his years and was comfortable working in the milieu of adults. Now, in Milan, I note in the book that Edmond was born into this network, a world of networks. There was the network of the Syrian Jews, and people from Aleppo had been going out into the world to Manchester, to the Philippines, to Hong Kong, to the US, in the 19th and early 20th century to trade. There was a family network. He had cousins who were doing business elsewhere throughout the world. There was the network of the Alliance, these schools that were effectively a kind of loose fraternity of people who had gone to the Alliance school in Alexandria or in Morocco. You kind of knew each other through that. So he's sent to Europe, and his father tells him, look for opportunities. Now, in his world, opportunities often meant gold. The Safras were not bankers of the sort that would make you a mortgage so you could buy your house. They helped facilitate trade. They looked for arbitrage opportunities. At the time, gold did not trade freely in Europe. As a result of the Bretton Woods agreement, it had been pegged at $35 an ounce. The London gold market remained closed. But there were places in the world where gold traded freely, namely the Middle East, India, and Hong Kong. And if you could buy gold and knew how to ship it and trusted someone on the other end, you could make a lot of money doing it. So Edmond Safra, again, at the age of 16, goes to Zurich. He goes to Amsterdam. He goes to Paris. He presents himself at the central banks and other banks and says, I want to buy gold for my father. They ship it to Beirut. He gets his brother-in-law, a doctor from Aleppo who had married his older sister, to move to Hong Kong, and says, you sit there, we'll send you the gold. You can sell it locally into the market to smugglers or people who are looking for a store of value. And that was his sort of first foray into business. This is what he was doing while other people were, again, a few years removed from his bar mitzvah. He was traveling around the capitals of Europe, trading and buying gold. He was also, in this period, financing films. Errol Flynn was trying to make a comeback and was making a big remake of William Tell. Edmond Safra was one of the people who helped finance that, along with some other Sephardic Jews who were in the film business. And this is a receipt from a production. They're making the La Fille de Regiment, which is is an opera. They were making a movie of it, and it's a bill that was sent to him at his address in Milan to pay for some prints of that film. So in his teens, he is traveling around Europe, buying gold, doing things like there were coins from the Habsburg Empire. There were the Joseph Thaler and the Maria Thaler. These were coins with the images of Empress Maria and Emperor Joseph. And in the Middle East, the coin with the face of a woman had a slightly lower value. So he would buy up the coins with Maria's likeness in Beirut in the Middle East, and they would ship them to Europe and swap them one for one with the coins with Joseph on its face. In 1952, the things start to go south in Beirut. The Safra family's apartment is ransacked. There's a bomb at the Alliance school, and they decide they need to go elsewhere. And at the time, there wasn't really anywhere for them to go. The US was not really taking immigrants. You couldn't just sort of show up in Italy or France and say, hey, I'm going to live here. But the one place that was taking Jews, one of the places was Brazil. And there were at the time, the early 50s, a small number of Sephardic Jews who had made their way to Brazil and Argentina. Edmond Safra, at the age of sort of 22, says, okay, family, we are picking up roots. We are going to move to Brazil. He moves his father, who is now becoming elderly, and his younger brother, Moise, his other younger brother, Joseph, he sends to boarding school at Whittingham College in England, which at the time, a lot of Sephardic kids from Egypt, Lebanon, Iraq were attending. And he goes to Brazil. This is a photo of his passport from Brazil that he ultimately got in the 60s. And you can see at the top where it says profession, it says comerciante, which means merchant, a person engaged in commerce, not a banker. When the Safras got to Brazil, because they were not citizens, they couldn't own a bank. And what they did instead was very quickly start to engage in a lot of export-import businesses. Brazil was kind of a closed economy, but it had a lot of things that the world wanted. So you see that he is trading coffee and sending it to New York. He's arranging barter transactions for goods from Hungary, industrial equipment from Germany, sending them in exchange for food products, soybeans from Brazil. He got together with a Syrian Jew in New York named Joe Michon, and they bought ships that were salvaged, and they would send them to Italy, and they would be broken down for scrap metal. So again, it's early 20s. He's engaged in an array of activities. They were involved in jute manufacturing. But he doesn't stay in Brazil for long. He is constantly rotating between Brazil, Beirut, where his father continued to own his bank. The bank was called Banque Crédit National. It became an official Lebanese bank in the late 50s. And Geneva, where he set up a trading operation called Sudafin. And what I'm showing you now is a letter of Moncada and Goldsmith, was one of the big they were gold traders, but also a sort of bank, a Sephardic bank based in London that had been there, I believe, since the 16 or 1700s. The Safras had relationships with them and the Rothschilds, and this is a letter relating to the trade of silver between Edmond Safra's organization and Moncada and Goldsmith. So he's rotating around from Brazil, where he has a range of businesses, to Geneva, where in 1959 he creates Trade Development Bank as a formal Swiss classic private bank. He's going back to Beirut to look after Banque Crédit National. He's spending the summers in the south of France. There's one place he wants to go next, which is New York. In 1963, the story goes, Edmond Safra was in New York. He went out to buy a hat and ended up buying this building. This is at right near the New York Public Library, right in the middle of town. It's called the Knox Building, which is built by the Knox Hat Company. He bought it for about $2 or $3 million in 1963. I have the document showing it. And he decides, I'm going to live in the penthouse on the top, and at the base, I'm going to start a new bank. A startup bank, an American consumer-facing bank called Republic Bank. So he gathers together about $10 million from investors, and he starts Republic Bank, and he opens that branch right there on 40th Street and Fifth Avenue. And he is so amazed that when he opens the bank, Robert F. Kennedy, who you can see in the front, he was the brother of John F. Kennedy, who had recently been slain and was a New York senator, shows up to cut the ribbon. Edmond Safra, you can see him 5 people to the left of Robert Kennedy, the sort of slightly chubby-faced guy smiling, looking at the camera. Now, the type of banking he did in Beirut was a very personal style of banking. In that world, you only lent money to people you knew. You didn't really lend money for a credit card. You might lend it against their crop coming in or a shipment of goods coming in. And if someone didn't pay you back, you wouldn't lend money to them again, because paying back was a matter of your family's honor. In Switzerland, the type of banking he did was classic private banking. A lot of his clients in Switzerland were people in Egypt or Lebanon or Syria or Morocco, or what they called the suitcase generation, people who might have to flee at any minute. And they just wanted to know that their money would be there. But here he was planting his flag in the middle of Chase and Citibank and all the thousands of American banks that were hustling to get deposits of middle-class customers and lend it out. For a few years, the bank did okay. But here again, he proved adept at integrating into whatever milieu he was in. If you talk to people about Republic Bank today, they will often say, oh yes, that was the television bank. Republic Bank's great innovation was that at the time, you couldn't compete by offering a higher interest rate on deposits. Regulations forbade that. And they also said you couldn't give anything worth more than $10 to somebody as a premium. You open an account, they might give you a toaster. But they realized there was nothing that would prohibit you from bringing a friend and saying, my friend will open an account, what will you give me? there was no limit on that, the size of that gift. So what they happened on was, if you brought in a friend and they opened up a $5,000 or $10,000 certificate of deposit for a year, you would get a black and white television. They announced this. This caught on very quickly. They wanted to get these deposits and lock them up because Edmond Safra had a global network where he would go and say, I will place these with a higher yielding instrument in a Greek bank, in the euro dollar market. He had this very global perspective and network even at the outset. And so what happened was, in short order, people were lining up around the corner to get televisions. One woman, Ida Schwartz, referred so many people. She got 20 or 24 TVs, and people apparently would call the bank asking how the remote would work. So by the 60s, the late 1960s, he in effect has a global empire constructed, where he has his father's bank in Beirut, Trade Development Bank in Geneva, which goes public in 1972, Republic Bank in New York, which goes public in the early 70s, and his brothers, who he set up with Banco Safra in Brazil, which is becoming a power in and of itself. And that is the story of the sort of financial journey of Edmond Safra. What I found fascinating about this is, as he was building this global empire, that the type of banking he did and the type of things he did with his money were really very much directly informed by his identity and practices of a Syrian Jew from Aleppo. Now, mind you, he himself was not born in Aleppo. He was born in Beirut, but the identity with that community, especially on a global basis, was extremely strong. This is a photo from 1981. This is the groundbreaking of the new headquarters for Republic. He bought that Beaux-Arts building where he had the apartment, and then what he did is he acquired the properties around it and then built a 30-story glass tower surrounding it. Perfect marriage of the old and the new. And at the groundbreaking, there were not one but two rabbis. If you go by that bank's headquarters today, you will see in the alcove there's space for a mezuzah. Edmond Safra was very serious about his Judaism. It wasn't a matter of going to shul, which he did all the time. It was a matter of who he was and how he conducted himself. At one of the talks I gave in the fall, a woman came up to me afterwards. She said, I was Edmond Safra's secretary and personal assistant, and every morning I had to give him his tallis so he could put on tefillin every day. He loved giving money to synagogues. Here he is signing, the end of writing the end of a Torah. The Aleppo community was as I mentioned, had a very particular mode of organization. In these communities, there was a formal community council. They had formal organizations for feeding the hungry, for providing dowries for women who couldn't afford it. That was essentially replicated in Beirut, and the Safras were always often the president of the community. These were funded by a tax called the Aricha. People who had more gave more, people who had less gave less. And what happened is that in the 50s and the 60s, as the communities of Beirut and Aleppo and Damascus implode, there are pogroms in Aleppo in the 1940s. Interestingly, Beirut, Lebanon was the one Arab country where the Jewish population actually increased after Israel's war for independence, because so many Jews from Syria moved there. But over the course of the 50s and the 60s, those communities came under pressure, and a lot of people left as well. Edmond Safra essentially set himself up in exile as a kind of one-person community council. And as the documents I looked at show, if there were a group of Jews in Brazil trying to build a synagogue, they would come to Edmond Safra and he would guarantee the amount. If there were a group of Egyptian Jews in Brooklyn looking for a synagogue, looking to create a synagogue, they would come to him and he would give them money. When the first synagogue in Spain since the Inquisition was built in 1974 in Madrid, they came to Edmond Safra and he said, you know what, name it after my father. It's called Beit Yaakov. You will find Beit Yaakov, Kol Yaakov, Ohel Yaakov, always after his father, because in the Syrian world, you do not name things after yourself when you are still alive. This was mimicked by a constant sort of personal involvement. His archives are full of people who would write him and say, I'm trying to get out of Beirut, where should I go? And he would say, go to Argentina, I'll give you a job at the bank there. Go to Brazil, we'll find you a job. Go to New York, we'll get you a job. He was a sort of one-man personal aid program for these communities and continuing to support them where they were in Beirut and Aleppo. One of my favorite anecdotes is that there's a small synagogue in Rhodes, the Mediterranean island, whose community had been decimated in the Holocaust, and he had been there one summer. And every summer, every fall, he would send $500 so they could have a chazan come for the high holiday services. What I'm showing you now is a letter from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Schneerson, from 1971. He's writing to Edmond Safra, and the occasion is that Edmond had given not one, but two synagogues to Sha'arei Tzion. Sha'arei Tzion is one of the big Syrian synagogues in Brooklyn, and it's a whole sort of drash on why it's particularly great to give two Sifrei Torah and not just one. Now, one of the places that was not part of his empire until later in his life was Israel. Edmond Safra had, during his early years, I would say, a complicated relation with Israel. As I mentioned, when he left to Europe, it was from Lod Airfield, and it was about to be Israel, but he would not come back to Israel for at least 34 years. The Safras were not really interested in Israel as a place to do business. It was a poor socialist country without much need of a sort of private banking system. In the 50s, he was already donating money to the tomb of Rabbi Meir Baal Hanes in Tiberias, putting rooms there in honor of his father. But I found a lot of documents in the 50s and 60s where people were asking him to invest in Israel, to get more involved with Israel, and the response was always that Edmond can't even correspond with people who live in Israel. And the reason was that at the time, there were blacklists against companies that did business with Israel, and his banks still had relationships with people in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and he still had a bank in Lebanon. And he feared that if he too publicly identified with Israel, that the Jews of Beirut and Aleppo would suffer. This started to change. And so what you see on the screen right now is a letter from 1962 between one of Edmond Safra's colleagues and Isaac Shalom. Isaac Shalom was the leader of the Syrian community in Brooklyn, and they're talking about Edmond sending him some money for Porat Yosef. Porat Yosef, if anybody has been to Jerusalem, is the big Sephardic yeshiva that overlooks the Western Wall. If you go there today, you will see that all the buildings are named after either Jacob Safra or Edmond Safra. This chart starts to change in the 70s. In 1976, Edmond Safra's rabbi from Beirut, Rabbi Isaac Atiyah, leaves Beirut and washes up in Bat Yam, just south of Tel Aviv. And I found correspondence where Edmond is essentially single-handedly financing the construction of his synagogue to the point of telling him, here's how much you should spend on air conditioning. And Edmond comes in 1981 under an assumed name to the consecration of that synagogue. In the 1980s, as the Syrian and Lebanese communities dwindle even further, he becomes more public in his identification with Israel. In 1991, his brothers and he would invest in an Israeli bank, and he became very close with Rabin and Peretz and Teddy Kollek. I mentioned his support for the Syrian Jewish community. As I said, a lot of people left in the 40s after there were pogroms there and riots, but a core was holding on. And this is one of my favorite documents. It's from 1979, and it's from Le Rabbin de Aleppo, the rabbis of Aleppo. There were still 7 or 8 rabbis hanging on. And it addresses Edmond in French, our dear benefactor with a great and generous heart. We, the rabbis of Aleppo, are asking you for help. Yom Tov Yedid, who was the chief rabbi, was suffering. He was in bad health. He had suffered some financial setbacks, and so they're asking him for help. And you could see it signed at the bottom in pen and pencil by 7 or 8 remaining rabbis who were still there in the 70s. And at the top, you could see in pen $7,500. And again, the woman who was his personal assistant, she came up to me and said, "That's my handwriting." Part of her day, every day, was going through these letters, and he would say how much to give, and it would be done. Um, so I said briefly, Edmond's sort of masterstroke when it came to helping the Syrian Jewish community came in 1994. There were still about 4,000 or 5,000 Jews left in Syria. Assad was holding them as a hostage. And there was a moment after the Gulf War where Assad had participated in the coalition where he was susceptible to pressure. And the Western countries started saying, why don't you let the Jews go? And he says, okay, well, there's some financing I want, et cetera, et cetera. He agrees, but his conceit was, well, I can't give people the impression that you can just leave Syria. So they all have to buy round-trip plane tickets because they're all going to come back. Someone at that moment calls Edmond Safra and says, I need 4,000 round-trip plane tickets. He pays for them on the spot. They leave in 1994, and that is essentially the end of almost 2,000 years of Jewish presence in Syria. Edmond Safra was a very traditional Halabi Jew. There was one area in which he departed from tradition, and that had to do in his personal life. Typically, a Syrian Jewish man in his late 20s or early 30s would marry someone from the community, someone usually an 18 or 19-year-old woman, and they would proceed to have several children, hopefully for them, some sons, because only the sons went into the family business. When Edmond Safra was in his 20s and 30s, he was living a peripatetic nomadic lifestyle. He was in 5 different countries. He didn't feel that it was right to settle down, and he wasn't really interested in the very young, comparatively unsophisticated women that he was being introduced to. So he was essentially a bachelor. In his late 30s, early 40s, he meets Lily, who would become his wife in 1976. She was an Ashkenazi Jew from Brazil. She was fabulously wealthy in her own right. Her husband had been one of the owner of the largest appliance retail chain in Brazil, and had been a client of the Safras. He died in the late 60s. They meet in the early 70s and get married in 1976. She had children from a prior marriage. The two of them would not have children of their own. This is a photo from 1988 of Edmond and Lily Safra. In many ways, he had this sort of charmed and gilded life. He had homes in Paris, Geneva, New York, London, and the south of France. In the 80s, he acquired a villa called La Leopolda. It had been built by King Leopold of Belgium for one of his mistresses. It's one of the most expensive private homes. He buys it in the early 80s for several $1 million and proceeds to upgrade it and is sort of showing it. In 1988, he has these, from which this photo was taken, 2 large parties to sort of introduce La Leopolda to everybody. One party is for sort of bankers and socialites and heads of state and people he sort of circulated with in one part of his life, and the other party was for 400 Syrian and Beiruti Jews who came for the event. And what should have been a high point of his life was actually marked the beginning of one of the strangest chapters in business history. And it's the chapter for which Edmond Safra is known because there was an entire 500-page book written about this episode. What had happened was soon after this party, there are articles that start to appear in newspapers in Peru, in France, in Switzerland, in Italy, saying things like Edmond Safra is a drug dealer. Edmond Safra is involved with the Medellin cartel. Edmond Safra is involved in the Iran-Contra affair. And Edmond Safra immediately felt that he knew who was behind it. In 1982, he had sold one of his banks, his Swiss private bank, to American Express, the blue chip American company. They wanted a big private bank, and they wanted Edmond Safra essentially as an employee. But in his world, Edmond Safra was treated like a king, and he still had Republic Bank of New York, which was growing very rapidly. And very quickly, within a matter of months after the acquisition, he has a falling out with the CEO of American Express. He leaves the company, sells his shares, And it's very clear to everybody that in 1988, when his non-compete, he had a 5-year non-compete with American Express, that he would start his own Swiss bank in Geneva from scratch. And there was concern at American Express that he would take all their clients, that all the clients would go running back to him. When these articles appear, Edmond Safra immediately says, I know American Express is behind this. And people thought he was crazy. It's an American company, a blue chip company, wouldn't do such a thing. He does two things. He hires private investigators and he starts suing in court the people who are publishing this stuff to try to find out who's behind it. And two things happen. At one of the trials, the defense turns over a dossier of material that they say, this is where we got the information. And at the top of it is a fax line, that tells you it was faxed from an American Express office. Secondarily, they had gotten a tip that there was a low-level kind of FBI/mafia informant named Tony Greco, who was going around the world trying to place these articles in various newspapers. He hires private detectives. They track this guy down to New York. They follow him to American Express's headquarters, and he goes out to lunch with a PR executive. And what turned out was that a couple of rogue employees in American Express's PR department had orchestrated this entire smear campaign against him. When he confronts American Express with the evidence, they agree to apologize. And rather than sue them, he says, you know what, just make $8 million in donations to a series of charities that I'm going to identify. And that was the end of that story. But for him, for a person where your name was your honor, where your name was your credibility, where people banked with you because who you were, it was a pretty grievous blow. I'm going to come back to this one in a minute. So that happened in 1988, 1999. Edmond Safra's life in the 90s was a mix of challenges that ultimately ended in, for him, tragedy. And if you look at the course of his life, the idea of an immigrant moving around, starting all these banks, getting this amazing real estate, becoming a community leader, giving away hundreds of millions of dollars, and creating a fortune of several billion, it's a kind of classic success story. But Edmond Safra's life and story ultimately, while they have all these elements of triumph, also have elements of tragedy. In the 90s, essentially 4 bad things happened. One, the story of the American Express, which for him, someone attacking his reputation was like the worst thing you could do. Second, he always looked much older than he was. In this photo here, he was 55, 56, which is essentially the age I am now. And I think he always looked sort of older than he was. He was not someone who was in the best of health. And in the early 1990s, he starts to become stricken with Parkinson's disease, which begins to limit his mobility, his speech, his ability to run this global empire. In 1997, again, he's now 65. He's realizing that it's really affecting him, and he wants to figure out a solution. Now, his banks, he had 2 main banks, Republic in New York, Safra Republic in Geneva. He owned personally 30% of the stock of both those banks. They were publicly held. And he always felt that a bank and a company was A, a family business, and B, one that should exist in perpetuity. The idea of selling off his banks was anathema to him. In 1997, Republic issued 100-year bonds, figuring it would be around for another 100 years. And he had always felt that the Safra family business had always been a family business, going back to Safra Frere in the 1870s, the business he did with his father. And it was his hope that his brothers and he could arrive at some agreements whereby they would pool their resources. He had set his brothers up in business in Brazil in the early 60s and essentially said, you guys take Brazil, I'll take the rest of the world. His 2 brothers, Moise and Joseph, built up Banco Safra into a very large and ultimately global financial institution that was privately held. They were the only 2 ones who owned it. So in 1997, as he's becoming ill, he's having conversations with his brothers about, can we somehow pool our assets? Can we figure out how to keep this going? Because Edmond did not have his own children. He would not appoint one of his many proteges or people who would work for him to be the CEO for the next generation. It had to be a member of the Safra family. There's an announcement, and effectively, they couldn't figure out how to do it. His brothers had their own bank, which was quite large. They lived in Brazil. They felt maybe that they wouldn't be treated the same way as Edmond was. And so in 1997, 1998, he realizes he can't strike a deal with his brothers on how to keep the business going. And he decides to sell the banks. In 1999, May 1999, see from this article, he decides to sell both his banks to HSBC for about $10 billion. Now, at the time, that was when $10 billion was still real money. You can see that it's priced at $72 a share. Now, that's 4 times high. These numbers mattered to Edmond Safra. He would usually choose to do deals on a Tuesday if he could, because in Genesis, there's language that God sees what he's done and says, and he saw that it was good twice. So Tuesday is seen as a very auspicious day. One of his banks, he waited. They had a deal all set up Monday night. He said, no, we have to wait till Tuesday morning, the 18th, because that's a fortuitous time to do it. So he sells for $72 a share. At the time, that was the largest price paid in cash for a bank in the United States. He's going to walk away with 30% of that, which is about $3 billion. Again, this should have been a moment of triumph, but that day, the next day, a friend of his comes from Geneva and says, Edmond, Mabruk. Mabruk is, congratulations in Arabic. What a wonderful thing. Congratulations. And he looked at her sadly and said, J'ai vendu mes enfants. I've sold my children. I've sold my babies. So for him, this was a moment of sadness, not triumph. That was May 1999. So he's going to sell these banks. And even then, at the age of 67, suffering with Parkinson's, he really has round-the-clock care at this time, doing quite poorly. He's intent on, he's going to set up another financial institution. He agreed with HSBC that he could take his own money and get money from other clients, and he was going to finally name a financial institution after himself, Edmond Safra Asset Management. The papers for this were being filled out in December 1999. When he died in a fire in Monaco that had been set by a member of his household staff. I know I'm getting a little late into the time, so I'm not going to go into great detail, but that was another episode of his life that was written about in Vanity Fair, and there are all these conspiracy theories about it. If we have some time in the discussion, people have questions, we can talk about it a little further. But he dies in December 1999, very suddenly, leaving behind a pretty large fortune, which was left to his foundation, bearing his name that his wife ran, and of course a legacy of a lifetime of achievement and philanthropy. In the years since his death, his wife Lily Safra just died last summer. She ran that foundation, and if you go around the world today, you will find 24 Edmond Safra synagogues, hospitals. The foundation focuses on 3 areas that were important to him: education, Jewish life, and medical research. And again, I mentioned that in his own lifetime, he would have never named anything after himself. He did not have his own children to sort of carry on his legacy and do things in his honor, but his foundation has done that to great effect. Again, if you go around the world and sort of community centers, synagogues, hospitals, anywhere in the Jewish world, but also in the non-Jewish world, you will find references to Edmond Safra's philanthropy. And I think with that, I will close up and stop sharing my screen. Have I stopped sharing the screen, Jonathan?
Yeah, the screen is stopped sharing. Okay. And thank you. That was really, really interesting. And only scratches the surface of really what is in the book. So I recommend people do read the book. If our audience have questions, please put them in the Q&A now. We have a question from Joyce Buffin. She says she was in Buenos Aires and noticed Edmond Safra's name on a plaque at a school there. What connection did he have with Buenos Aires?
As I mentioned that in the 50s, they, he went to Rio and Sao Paulo. Similarly, there were groups of Syrian Jews who went to Buenos Aires, who went to Colombia, who went to Venezuela, and they formed their communities there. So, and I've been to, there's a Syrian synagogue in Buenos Aires that I've been to, and you see the names on the reserved seats and on the plaques are the same names that I know from Brooklyn. He had cousins who went to Buenos Aires, and his banks had offices there. They did business there in the 60s and 70s. So he was frequently in Argentina, and it was a sort of a node in the Safra financial empire, and of course in the global Syrian diaspora.
Naomi Stone asks, what is the origin of the name Safra?
That's interesting. So Safra in Arabic, it can mean yellow or gold. So that would be a fortuitous sense that in Arabic, as is the case probably in Yiddish as well, and in English, like people are named for their professions. You have Smith, you have Mason, Shochet. In Arabic, Dabah, anyone named Dabah, that's a slaughterer. People who work with stones. So it could be a lucky coincidence that the name Safra is, a word for sort of gold, and that they were destined to be working in that profession.
Where is the villa you mentioned, and what became of it?
Yes, so it's called La Leopolda, and you'll have to excuse my French pronunciation, which is very bad. It's in Villefranche-sur-Mer. It's a town up in the hills, about 20 miles outside of Monaco. He owned it at his death. His wife owned it, spent her summers there. If you Google around for it, you will see that in 2008, Lily Safra agreed to sell it to a Russian oligarch whose name escapes me. He was going to pay $500 million for it. He put down a $50 million deposit, and the financial crisis came, and he said, you know what? I don't want to pay. I don't want to buy this place, and I want my deposit back. And she said, no, I'm keeping the deposit. He sued her. She won in court, and she gave the money away to charity. So she still owns it. Okay, she died in August, so now her estate owns it. But if you Google La Leopolda Safra, you will see photos and reference to it.
Fascinating. Now, on the sleeve of the book, one of the quotes you put here is from Elton John, and he refers to Edmond Safra as his treasured friend. It struck me as quite an unusual friendship. I wondered what you knew about this, how they met, and what kind of connection they had.
I mean, one of the amazing things about Edmond Safra's life was that he had this facility where he could be, on the streets of Beirut getting a shawarma one day, and the next day with David Rockefeller, rubbing shoulders with the Rothschilds and doing business with them, and heads of state and people in the arts. After he, Lily Safra, who was his wife, he was a very private person. Most of his charitable efforts in his earlier life were focused on Judaism and synagogues and things like that. His wife, Lily Safra, was a great collector of art. She was interested in fine art, in opera, in philanthropy, in society. She was friends with designers. She was friends with Prince Charles and Camilla. And so it would not be uncommon to go to their house in the south of France and find an Israeli politician there, and Elton John there, and business people. I wanted to mention that for this group especially, one of the other quotes is from Lord Jacob Rothschild, who I interviewed, and we did an event together in London for the launch of the book in 1972, when Edmond Safra's bank went public. There's some correspondence where Edmond says, "Oh, you got to keep me away from the Ashkenazi banks. They're going to kill me." The P.S. He ended up having Rothschilds lead his public offering, but at the press conference, Jacob Rothschild, who led the offering, stood up and said, "Edmond, I've known you for some time. My father knew your father. My grandfather our grandfathers knew your grandfathers. They were trading. The Safra family were trading with other Jewish banks in London in the late 19th century, straight through the 20th century as well."
Well, I think we're out of time almost. It's been fascinating to talk to you, really interesting to hear the story. This is the book. If you want to buy a copy, there will be a link on our follow-up email tomorrow. If you buy it through that, Milim will get a few pennies, but the book won't cost you any more, but it's available at all good booksellers. And to say thank you to you, I'm going to send you some of my photographs. This is of Magen David Adom, the Israeli ambulance service in action. And also, as we have learned, you have an interest in Leeds United. We'll be finding you a copy of Promised Land by our very own Anthony Clevane, which will wing its way to you at the same time. So we hope you enjoy both of those. Now, before we leave you, just a few words about our forthcoming programme. So next week, we have the author, academic and commentator Dov Waxman. He and I will be discussing contemporary anti-Semitism, how it might differ between the US and the UK, and we'll be talking about the ongoing debate about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Then on the 27th of March, we welcome Jonathan Neumann from Israel. He will be speaking about Tikkun Olam, the theme of his book, To Heal the World, how the Jewish left corrupts Judaism and endangers Israel. That promises to be a thought-provoking talk. And finally, for now, on the 3rd of April, the world-renowned economist Oded Galor is with us to speak about his book, The Journey of Humanity, The Origins of Wealth and Inequality. We have much, much more coming up, so please do visit milim.org.uk, sign up to our newsletter, and that way you'll be sure not to miss anything. All of our events are free, but you can make a donation. There is a link on our website, and also there should be an address just coming up in the chat now. So it remains for me to thank our guest, Daniel Gross. Thank you once again, Daniel. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all again